Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Order. Before I call Sir Keir Starmer to ask his urgent question, I would emphasise to the House that the purpose of my selecting this urgent question today was to give an opportunity to the Minister to explain to the House what action the Government has taken in response to the order of the House, and an opportunity for other members to question him on those matters. It is not an occasion for the House to debate whether or not a contempt of the House may have occurred. There may or may not be later occasions for that matter to be discussed. This is the correct procedure, and I know the House will trust me to know of what I speak. Urgent question, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union if he will make a statement on the release of the impact assessments arising from sectorial analysis carried out by Her Majesty's Ministers to the Select Committee on exiting the European Union.
Minister Robin Walker.
Speaker, on the 1st of November, this House passed a motion asking that impact assessments arising from sectoral analyses be provided to the Committee on exiting the European Union. Mr. Speaker, this government takes very seriously its parliamentary responsibilities and has been clear it would be providing information to the committee. In the past 3 weeks, departments have worked to collate and bring together this information in a way that is accessible and informative. I'm glad to be able to confirm that this information has been provided not only to the Committee for exiting the European Union, but also to House of Lords EU Committee and indeed devolved administrations. I can also, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, inform the House that we have initiated discussions with the parliamentary authorities to make this information available to all colleagues through a reading room. We were clear from the start that we would respond to the motion, but also that the documents did not exist in the form requested. Indeed, I made clear to the House during the debate on the day that there has been some misunderstanding as to what the sectoral analysis actually is. It is not a series of 58 impact assessments. The sectoral analysis, as I said, is a wide mix of qualitative and quantitative analysis contained in a range of documents developed at different times since the referendum. The House of Commons itself has recognised that while ministers should be as open as possible with Parliament, the government also has an obligation to consider where it would be in the public interest for material to be published. Furthermore, it's important to recognise in some cases there are commercially and confidential information in the analysis, and in many cases the analysis was developed to underpin advice to ministers on negotiation options in various scenarios. It is well understood, as was the case under successive administrations, that such advice to ministers must remain private. In light of all that, my Right Honourable Friend the Secretary of State made a statement on the 7th of November in which he explained that given the documents did not exist in the form requested, it would take some time to collate and bring together information in a way that was accessible and informative for the committee. He committed that these reports would be provided within 3 weeks. In providing the information to the committee yesterday, we have met that commitment. Parliament has endorsed the responsibility of ministers not to release information that would undermine our negotiating position, and contrary to what has been asserted in some places, the committee did not give any firm assurances that what was passed to them would not subsequently be published in full. Where there are precedents for government agreeing to pass information to select committees in confidence, these have been on the basis of assurances received before material is shared, or a clear set of rules such as those governing intelligence material. When he met the Secretary of State, the chairman of the Select Committee did say that he was willing to enter into a dialogue after the Select Committee had received documents from the government. But this is not the same as assurance that if we had provided confidential or sensitive material, it would not be published, and it is not in keeping with the usual practice of committees on these sensitive issues. As such, the sectoral reports provided do not contain information which would undermine the UK's hand in negotiations or material that is commercially or market sensitive. But the House should be in no doubt this has been a very substantial undertaking. We have been as open as possible, subject to the overwhelming national interest of preserving our negotiating position. We have collated over 800 pages of analysis for the committees, less than a month from the motion being passed, and this covers all the 58 sectors. We now consider the motion of the 1st November 2017 to have been satisfied.
Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, transparency and accountability are two words this government does not understand. On the 1st of November, after a 3-hour debate, this House voted in favour of a humble address requiring all 38 sectoral analyses to be passed to the Brexit Select Committee. Not some of the reports, not redacted copies, the full reports. The government did not seek to amend the humble address, nor did it vote against the motion. After your advice to us, Mr. Speaker, the government accepted that the motion was binding. It is simply not open to the Secretary of State to choose to ignore it and to pass to the Select Committee the documents that he chooses. Whether he's in contempt of Parliament is a matter we'll come to at some later date, but he's certainly treating Parliament with contempt. The Secretary of State says, and the Minister has reported, that he did not get assurances from the Select Committee about how the documents would be used. The Minister therefore better answer some pretty blunt questions this morning. What assurances were sought that were not given? And he better tread carefully, because there'll be an audit trail here, and if he can't answer that question, if he didn't pursue the assurances, if he didn't suggest a course of action that was rejected, his cover for not disclosing these will be blown. Mr. Speaker, this is not a game. This is the most important set of decisions that this country has taken for decades. They need to be subjected to proper scrutiny. In my experience, the biggest mistakes are made when decisions are not scrutinised. And can I remind the Minister and the Secretary of State that until this House passed the motion on the 1st of November, ministers routinely claimed that these analyses were extensive and authoritative. They say they've now put the documents together. Mr. Speaker, in September they answered a Freedom of Information request. The first question is, do you hold the material? To which the answer was yes. And that calls into serious question the explanation now being put before this case. Finally this, Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply concerned that the sum total of documents generated by the government's work on the impact of their approach to Brexit on the economy can be squeezed into 2 lever arch files. That's the volume of paperwork I would have expected for a pretty routine Crown Court trial in my old world. If this is the case, we should all be worried. Is that the extent of the analysis? But either way, it's a very sorry state of affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me address some of the misconceptions in the Right Honourable Gentleman's statement, because we have not edited or redacted reports. At the time the motion was passed and subsequently, we were clear that the documents did not exist in the form requested. We have collated information in a way that doesn't include some sensitive material, but the documents, which he freely admits he hasn't seen, do not contain redactions. It is noticeable that the original suggestion of redactions in the debate on the 1st of November came from him. And came from him speaking from the front bench of the opposition. He also said in the debate that he had accepted all along that the government should not put into the public domain any information that would undermine our negotiating position, and that he accepts there is a level of detail and confidential issues and tactics that should not be discussed. Statements that the Right Honourable and learned gentleman made during the debate itself. And let me tell him the logical consequences of that position. He suggested that there are mechanisms available which allow for sharing of material in advance for select committees, and he's right, of course, as I addressed in my opening statement. My Secretary of State met with the chair of the Select Committee and discussed these terms. It was very clear that, as the chair has said himself in Parliament, that he wanted to receive all the documents first before he would give any assurances as to the way in which they would be treated. And that, on that basis, we had to be clear that we had to protect commercially sensitive information. In the absence of any restrictions on what the Select Committee might do with the documentation, the government had to be mindful of its obligations not to allow sensitive information to be public. But let me be clear again, we've been as open as possible within those obligations. The material we provided to the Select Committee is very substantial. It is bizarre for the Right Honourable Gentleman to dismiss it without having yet seen it. And when committee members have had an opportunity to consider it fully and to reflect on it, I think they will reasonably conclude that the government has fully discharged the terms of the motion. We have shared over 800 pages of analysis with the committee. The analysis described the activity in each sector and the current regulatory regime for the sector. The report set out existing frameworks from across the globe for how trade is facilitated between countries in the sectors and sector views. These views cover a range of representative cross-sector views from businesses and organisations across the UK, and we've taken care to incorporate up-to-date views from stakeholders, such as views on the proposed implementation period. To his question, does this represent the sum of the government's analysis? Of course it does not. The motion referred to sectoral analyses, and we have responded to a motion by sharing those sectoral analyses. I note the statement from the Select Committee following its meeting this morning, and I welcome the fact that arrangements will be made for committee members to view documents in confidence. I think that when they do, they will find there is a great deal of useful and valuable information here. I can assure the House and the Committee that the Secretary of State will also be accepting their request to discuss the content. Mr. Speaker, I can assure the House that my department takes its responsibilities to Parliament extremely seriously. We have provided a vast amount of factual information to help the committees and this House in their scrutiny. I am confident we have met the requirements of the motions whilst respecting our overriding duty to the national interest.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, if the government wished to resist the publication of the papers it had, it should have voted against the motion. And if it wished to qualify or to edit the papers that it had, it should have sought to amend the motion. And we cannot allow post-Brexit to start reducing parliamentary sovereignty to a slightly ridiculous level. Would the Minister at least consider the possibility of sharing at least with the chairman of the Brexit Select Committee the papers in the original form they were in when we had our vote before this editing process started? And then no doubt the House will be guided by the chairman of the Brexit Committee on changes, omissions which are legitimately in the national interest and should be made.
I share my right honourable and learned friend's commitment to ensuring that the House can scrutinise valuable information in this respect. But the problem with the motion that was passed is that it referred to sectoral impact analyses. We were clear from the start that the motion did not, the documents it referred to did not exist in the form that was required. Therefore, what we have done is to pull together sectoral analysis for the Select Committee and its scrutiny. I think that will prove valuable to them.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a day in June 2016, the people of the United Kingdom were asked one question in one day. And as a result of that, the answer they gave to that one question, there's no going back on Brexit. On the 1st of November, Parliament was asked one question, and for the intervening 27 days, the government has done everything possible to deny and defy the instruction, not the request, but the instruction that it was given by this Parliament, to whom sovereignty, we are told, is being restored by the Brexit process. Can I remind the Minister that the question of what the government will provide to the Select Committee is not for the government or indeed for the Select Committee to decide. This Parliament has decided, and there is no discussion, no debate, no negotiation as to the extent to which that decision will be complied with. It must be complied with in full. Otherwise, as the letter that's been published recently by the Chair of the Select Committee makes clear, the Select Committee on exiting the European Union will have to consider whether to raise a motion for contempt. How is that going to look to our European partners, Mr. Speaker? How is it going to, what is it going to do to the credibility of the government, in particular to the Brexit team, if they end up being held in contempt by the Parliament to which they claim to be returning sovereignty? Can I ask the Minister to confirm that the resolution of the House was not about what was made public, but about what was provided to the Select Committee? Does he not accept in those circumstances that what must be made available to the Select Committee is everything, absolutely everything? And if the government is not prepared to comply with that instruction, they should not be in government. And can he tell us categorically, first of all, does he accept that a decision on what to publish within the rights of parliamentary privilege is for the Select Committee alone to decide? And secondly, can he confirm that he and his government are prepared to trust the judgment of that committee on behalf of this House to exercise responsible judgment as to what the public are entitled to know?
The honourable gentleman asks a number of important questions. I would hope to hear some welcome from him for the fact that we've shared the information in these reports with the devolved administrations, and when I gave evidence to select committees recently in Scotland, it was a question on which we were pressed whether we would do that. But I would say to him, absolutely we do respect the fact that the Select Committee has the complete choice and discretion over what gets published of the information that is shared with it, and that is why the government has published the information to the Select Committee in the way that it has.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, can I just say to my right honourable friend, of course he has every right to ensure, as the EU has given out in its guidance, that not all confidential information is necessarily made available, otherwise that might restrict our negotiating position. But then can I also urge him to have that discussion with the chairman and ask him specifically what is it that he was expecting that he has now not got in terms of the documents.
I thank my right honourable friend for that question and his urging. I shall certainly take account of both of the points that he makes.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the willingness of the Secretary of State to appear before the Select Committee, a decision we made this morning? Can I ask the Minister to convey to the Secretary of State our wish that he should do so very speedily indeed? Now, given that it is quite clear that the Select Committee has received edited documents, in other words, they do not contain everything that is in the possession of the government, can I say to the Minister that that is not in keeping with the motion passed by the House of Commons? Can I secondly say to him that I made it very clear to the Secretary of State what procedure the Select Committee would use to consider the reports, and if I may put it like this, I do object to any suggestion that the Select Committee, or I as Chair, cannot be trusted to do our job.
Well, I have great respect for the right honourable gentleman, and I will certainly communicate his message to the Secretary of State. And I do believe that the point he makes about the information in the analyses is the point that what the motion referred to was not what existed at that time. What we have tried to do is ensure that there is full information available to his committee, and I think when he has had the chance to scrutinise that and indeed ask questions of ministers about that, he will find that information very useful to his scrutiny.
John Whittingdale.
As my honourable friend has said, there are 850 pages of these documents, and so far the chairman of the Select Committee is the only member who has actually seen them. But can I say to my honourable friend that I understand these documents have been sent to 2 Select Committees of Parliament and to the devolved administrations, and as a former chairman of the Select Committee, I can say that leaks are not without precedent, and I would not want the government to make available any information that, if it became public, it could undermine our negotiating position.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for the points he makes. He makes an important point, but of course we want to ensure that as much information as can be made available to the Select Committee is available within the constraints that I've discussed.
Tom Brake.
Mr. Speaker, why, when the Bank of England has published the frankly chilling implications of no deal, does the government insist on selectively editing the sectoral reports? And is it true, as I was told by a DEXU insider, that what the government have done is release selective sensitive documentation whilst withholding the bulk of that sensitive information?
To his last question, no.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find that I agree with the far of the House and the chairman of the Select Committee on their comments they've made. But I do understand, sir, there is a dilemma for the government. There is one recent motion that clearly says all documents should be delivered. There is a previous motion in this House that says the government should not produce anything that damages our negotiations. I do think those motions are not clear, so would it not be an idea for the government to come back with another motion clarifying the situation?
Well, I'm grateful for my honourable friend's suggestion. Of course, such suggestions are not necessarily for me to respond to, but it's certainly something we will have a look at.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, the Secretary of State said on the Marr Show that we have 50, nearly 60 sector analyses already done. In September, this was reiterated in the response to my Freedom of Information request. In October, the Secretary of State confirmed this to our committee and said the reports were in excruciating detail and the Prime Minister had seen the summaries. In November, we heard that they never existed. On what basis, Mr. Speaker, can completed reports be uncompleted? And on what basis is it right that the government do anything other than give the reports in full to the Select Committee in line with the resolution of this House?
The Government has provided the reports covering the 58 sectors to the Select Committee, and I look forward to the Select Committee being able to scrutinise those in detail. But I say to the Honourable Lady, she has been persistent in pressing for as much of this information as possible to be put in the public domain. Her front bench have also been persistent at recognising that not all the information subject to negotiations could possibly be done so without damaging our national interest.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue now is not whether it is in the government's interest to publish these documents or not. If the government didn't want to publish them, it should have voted down or amended the humble address. The question now is whether the terms of that motion, which in all precedent is a binding motion, unlike the previous motion passed earlier in the year, which was not a humble address and not a binding motion. To meet this motion, it is not at the discretion of the government to decide what to take out. It is now at the discretion of the Select Committee. And I therefore urge the government either to meet the terms of the motion in full or to seek to put down a new motion.
I take my honourable friend's expertise and parliamentary procedure extremely seriously, and I recognise the point he's making. We do feel that we have responded to the motion in full by preparing for the Select Committee sectoral analysis. But the point I would make to him is that the sectoral analysis did not exist in the form that was requested in the motion at the time.
Pat McFadden.
Speaker, this situation is entirely of the government's making.
Absolutely.
The motion passed by this House did not give the government discretion to take this information and decide for itself what to give to the Select Committee and what not to give to the Select Committee. So the government has not complied with the motion that it did not resist. And there's another underlying point here, apart from the questions of parliamentary privilege and contempt, and it is this. Do we believe that the public has a right to know the consequences of the options facing the country on Brexit? I believe they do. Does the Minister agree?
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman knows that we have responded to the motion. We accepted that the motion was binding, and we have therefore brought information forward for the Select Committee, and we've gone further than that. We've brought information forward for the Lords Committee, for the devolved administration, and we are now in discussions to make sure that information can be provided in confidential reading rooms to the whole House. But of course, what is not in the interests of the public of this country is to put information, to publish information to the other side, which could be sensitive to our negotiating position. And that is what this House has repeatedly voted for us not to do.
Mr. Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, I think most people would accept that it's perfectly reasonable to exclude commercial, market and negotiation-sensitive information. But unfortunately, that was not expressly excluded in the terms of the humble address on the 1st of November. So will my honourable friend look carefully at the option of the government bringing forward a revised motion expressly excluding that information from the material to be supplied to the Select Committee?
Well, my honourable friend, as have many honourable friends, raises an interesting point, and it's something that we will certainly look into. But what we have done is to ensure that the Select Committee has information on the sectoral analysis that the government has conducted, and I think that's an important step taken in response to the motion of the House.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Speaker, in his letter of the 2nd of November, my honourable friend, the chair of the committee, wrote the following. Once the material has been provided to the committee, I would be very happy to discuss with you any particular concerns you may have about publication of parts of the material so that the committee can take these into account in making its decision on release. On the 27th of November, the Secretary of State wrote, "We have received no assurances from the committee regarding how any information passed will be used." Does the Minister agree with me that the Secretary of State's letter of the 27th of November is a blatant misrepresentation of what was agreed? And does he agree that the Secretary of State should withdraw that remark and apologise for it to my honourable friend, the chair of the committee?
No, I don't.
Minister. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it is extremely important that we understand exactly what it is that was voted on and which the Select Committee seeks disclosure of. I am reminding myself of the motion that was in two parts. One, it referred to the list of sectoral analyses, And then it went on to make it clear that it was the impact assessments arising from those analyses that be provided to the Select Committee. And as the Honourable Member for Feltham and Heston then referred to, was the evidence provided by the Secretary of State to the Select Committee back in October, and I remind myself of question 131 and 132. And in his answers, the Secretary of State made it clear that those impact assessments existed, as it is put, in excruciating detail, and that a summary had been provided to the Prime Minister, which she'd read. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister confirm that what this House now seeks the Government to disclose are the impact assessments?
Well, my right honourable friend is, as always, forensic in her questioning. I would make the point to her that we were very clear when we were debating this motion that exactly what the motion referred to was not available at that time. Of course, there are various assessments and various documents held by government which have been worked on over time addressing the individual sectors. What we have sought to do, and what we've provided the Select Committee with, is actually a great deal more information than existed at the time of the Secretary of State's evidence to the Select Committee, and I think that will be valuable to them in their scrutiny.
Ben Bradshaw.
The main issues dividing this House, Mr. Speaker, at this stage in the Brexit negotiations are our continued membership of the Customs Union and the single market. And ministers say constantly they don't want to reveal anything that could weaken their negotiating hand. But the government's made its position clear. The European Union has accepted that the government wants a hard Brexit. So why would it damage the government's negotiating position to put that information out? Can he confirm that the information in the edited documents will help members of this House reach a view on whether or not we should stay in the Customs Union and the single market?
I can confirm to the honourable gentleman that the information in the edited documents will be valuable to this House, but I think those documents are actually documents which are, I think it's wrong to describe them as edited documents in the way that he does. I would describe them as comprehensive sectoral analyses which the government has provided for the Select Committee and will be providing on a confidential basis to the House. But to the honourable gentleman's question about the Customs Union and the single market, I'd remind him that he, like I, stood on a manifesto that said that we will respect the referendum result and confirm that the UK will be leaving the Customs Union and the single market.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister is making a gallant and courteous defence of a situation which is unlikely to satisfy everybody in this House because of the terms of the humble address. But there are two aspects to this which do need to be separated. One is the requirement to provide everything to the Select Committee, which the humble address did call for. And the second is the fact that surely no one in this House would want our country to go into the negotiating chamber in a weaker position as a result of decisions taken here. And the Shadow Secretary of State recognised himself that there is a way of dealing with these things, which is to redact what would be sensitive. Unfortunately, because the humble address didn't cover that, Mr. Speaker, I believe it is now strongly in the government's interest to put forward a motion to amend the humble address, which many of us in this House would strongly support.
Well, my honourable friend, like many honourable friends on this side of the House, suggests an approach to the government. It's certainly something for which we will be giving due consideration.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The crucial issue here is the government's failure to be open and transparent with public and Parliament on the consequences of its approach to Brexit. And it's not just over these papers that they're doing this, Mr. Speaker. They are refusing to give clear examples of the spending reprioritisation that's going on in Parliament, in departments, as a result of the assessments that have been made in these papers and the government's policies on Brexit. Will it publish a breakdown by department of the funding that they are giving to departments to cope with their approach to Brexit?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman's question strays quite a long way beyond the question that we're discussing at the moment, but I think we will absolutely continue to engage with Parliament, with its select committees, to support their scrutiny and provide them with as much information as we can, consistent with the national interest.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Just to rub it in, who was it who first suggested the use of redaction?
Confirm that that was the right honourable and learned gentleman sitting opposite me.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has mentioned the devolved administrations on a number of occasions. I'm advised by Scottish Government colleagues that the documents they've received contain nothing substantial at all about Scotland. On the 24th and 25th of October, the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union gave evidence respectively to the Scottish Affairs Committee and the Exiting the EU Select Committee that assessments of the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy existed and would be shared with the Scottish Government. Will he confirm that those unedited documents will now be shared without further delay?
I can confirm to the Honourable and Learned Lady that the documents that are being shared with the Select Committee are also being shared in the usual way with permanent secretaries of the devolved administrations on the same basis they've been shared with the Select Committee. And those sectoral analyses do, in many cases, contain important analysis of Scottish issues.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Speaker, could I gently suggest to my honourable friend, for whom I have the greatest of respect, that there is a bit of a rethink on this matter before the Secretary of State appears before our committee in the coming days. But could I also urge him that actually the really important thing at this stage is to get a move on with the negotiations and ensure that the companies up and down the country which are in limbo at the moment know what we are going to do, because we have to move forward in December. We cannot stand still.
My honourable friend makes a hugely important point. I think we all want to ensure that we have the most successful approach to negotiations, that we move forward in December. We talk about the implementation period, which is hugely important to the company, and the deep and special partnership that we want to form between the UK and the EU, and I certainly take his points on board.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the rightful assertion by the Brexit Committee that it will decide what information is published and what will not be published, does the Minister accept that there is a very real danger that if more weight were given to transparency than to protecting our negotiating position, that the national interest could be put in jeopardy? And therefore, would he agree that the best way forward now is to seek clarification from this House that it does not wish information which would be sensitive to be placed in the committee's hands, and therefore bring a motion to the House along those lines?
Well, the honourable gentleman reinforces a position which has been made by many of my honourable friends. As I've said, we will take due consideration of that. But he is right, of course, that we need to make sure we protect the absolute national interest in this process of ensuring that information-sensitive negotiations remains confidential.
David Jones.
In all his dealings with his European Union counterparts, has my honourable friend ever formed the view that they pay no heed to the proceedings of this House and indeed have no interest in the contents of any documents that may be produced to any of its select committees?
My honourable friend makes my right honourable friend makes an interesting suggestion there. I would say that proceedings of this House, certainly as they're reported by this press, are sometimes of great interest to our continental colleagues, but I do take his point.
Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, the Department has handed over some 850 pages, but the Minister has made clear that some information has been withheld. If that additional material had also been handed over, how many pages would it have been? Is it another couple of hundred, more or less, or has the information not actually been compiled?
The honourable gentleman asks a hypothetical question to which I'm afraid I don't have an answer.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
It was a mistake not to amend the opposition motion, and as a result, the government is now skating on very thin parliamentary ice. The issue can be solved next week if the government were to come back with a sensible motion, which every member in this House really ought to support.
As with other honourable friends, I take my honourable friend's suggestion very seriously.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By not releasing the papers in its original form, is he aware that the implication is that I and other members of the Select Committee cannot be trusted to act in the national interest?
No, I don't believe that is the case at all. We believe that the Select Committee has a serious job to do in scrutiny, and that's why these papers have been produced at great length to help to inform that scrutiny.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be rather more interested in seeing the impact assessments drawn up by the EU
view of the impact of Britain leaving the EU and how it's affecting their negotiating position? Did he share my curiosity that members opposite are not keen to scrutinise those documents?
The trouble with the interest of the honourable gentleman, which is of great fascination to members of the House and many spectators beyond its environ, is that it is not even adjacent to the question before us. But I'm sure the honourable gentleman can entertain himself in the long winter evenings that lie ahead. Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is not my definition of taking back control. It's a huge mess that the government has got itself into, and I think it shows, Mr. Speaker, the limits of their clever tactic of not engaging in opposition motions by sitting on their hands. The fact is, though, despite what the Minister says, that a motion, a humble address, which is compulsory for the government to act on, has been carried. Not for these documents to be edited, not for them to be changed. That job now goes to the Select Committee, and they've got to get on and publish it, and they've got to publish them now.
I'd say to the Right Honourable Lady that, as I made very clear on the day that we debated this issue, the documents did not exist in the form that we requested. We took the motion of the House extremely seriously, and that is why we have made sure that there is a great deal of information that's been provided to the Select Committee.
It did.
Tom Burstglove.
Mr. Speaker, has any formal protocol been put down and conveyed by the committee to ministers about how they would handle this information? Because I think that is pertinent in all of this.
Yeah, well said.
It is, yeah. Not that I'm aware of.
Williams.
Mr. Speaker, if I could have the Minister's attention. What guidelines were provided to officials editing the document as to what should be excluded?
Very good. As I've made clear to the House, this information was pulled together from a range of documents. As I've also made clear, we have to ensure that commercially sensitive information and information that would be prejudicial to the national interest could not be at risk of being published. But this has been a process of ensuring that there is more information for the committee, not less.
Suella Fernandez.
Speaker, does the Minister share my concern as to how a letter sent by the Secretary of State to the Deputy Committee managed to reach journalists at the Daily Mirror before it was considered by the committee? Does that encourage him or discourage him when it comes to sharing confidential information?
Honourable friend raises a very interesting point, and of course all leaks should be taken extremely seriously.
Mr. David Lammy.
The Minister will understand that it's important that the Executive gets on with policy, but there is a fundamental role in our Constitution for Parliament to hold the Executive to account and to scrutinise this hugely important decision. His Secretary of State said that the information existed in excruciating detail and that the Prime Minister had seen the summaries. For that reason, it's hard to understand why we can't see the entirety of information, if so with redaction. Can he explain why that is not now the case?
I'd say to the honourable gentleman, he's absolutely right about the balance we need to strike. We do need to get on with this role, but we also absolutely respect the role of parliamentary scrutiny in this process, which is why the information that has been provided to the committee is comprehensive and in great detail and goes beyond the type of summaries that he refers to, and indeed that his right honourable and learned friend suggested might be an answer to this. We've actually provided much more information than just summarising reports could have done.
Order. I will come to the honourable gentleman potentially in a moment, but point of order, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the debate that we've just had, it's clear there's a lot of concern from members across the House that the government's not satisfied the motion passed less than a month ago. Mr. Speaker, you've been very clear in your advice that the motion passed was binding. After the debate on the 1st of November, you said, and I quote, "I would expect the Vice-Chamberlain of the Household to present the humble address in the usual way." The expectation of this House was that the papers would be handed over in full, unedited. Anything less than this would be, I believe, a contempt of Parliament. Can I seek your guidance on whether you believe the government has adequately and satisfied the motion and the expectations of the House? If not, would failure to comply be considered a contempt of the House? And if so, what would be the best way for members to proceed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Is it very specifically further to, and therefore on the point raised by, the honourable and learned gentleman? It is. Point of order, Mr. Pete Wishart.
As you will know, I wrote to you on the 7th of November asking you to consider contempt proceedings against the government for failing to provide these Brexit analysis papers in full, as mandated, as you said, in a fully binding motion agreed by the House. Now, you very generously, Mr. Speaker, gave the government 3 weeks to comply, and you said you were awaiting the outcome of these conversations between the Secretary of State and the Chairman of the Committee. We have now had these conversations, and we have now heard the response from the Chairman of the Select Committee, who has stated in this very chamber just a few moments ago that they do not meet them in full. I'm asking you, therefore, Mr. Speaker, to reconsider my letter of the 7th of November and consider to bring contempt motions as detailed in page 273 of Erskine. I'm sure you're aware of the significance of this, Mr. Speaker, and I know you'll deal with this sensitively, but this is contempt, and the government must be held accountable for its failure to comply.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable and learned gentleman. Order. Now I'll come to the honourable gentleman in due course. Potentially. Oh, it's on this very matter, is it? Well, very well. Let's hear Mr. Marcus Fish.
On page 201 of Erskine May, Mr. Speaker, the section on ministerial accountability quotes from a resolution that was passed by both Houses of Parliament in the 96 and 97 session, which makes it clear that ministers don't have to disclose all information if it's not in the public interest to do so. Does that have any bearing on these?
Ordinarily grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I say this in no spirit of discourtesy to him, but I am familiar with precedent in relation to these matters, and I didn't particularly need to be advised of the presence of that material in Erskine May. The honourable gentleman won't be surprised to know that I have attended to these matters recently and regularly. What I would say in response to the honourable gentleman, the member for Perth and North Perthshire, very specifically, is that I can, of course, reconsider his letter, but I hope he won't mind my saying that I think it would be more orderly and courteous if he were to write to me again, if he is so minded, in the light of the developments that have ensued since his earlier letter. This is not being pedantic, it really isn't. It is a question of procedural propriety. And if I receive a letter from the honourable gentleman, I will consider it and respond in a timely way. Beyond that, what I want at this point to say is that I think it is well known to members, and certainly to such legal luminaries as the former Director of Public Prosecutions, that members wishing to allege a contempt should, in the first instance, raise it not in a point of order, nor indeed in the media, but by writing to me as soon as practicable after the member has given notice of the alleged contempt or breach of privilege. I then decide whether or not the matter should have precedence. It is certainly also well known to the honourable member for Perth and North Perthshire that this is the procedure, as he availed himself of it a few weeks ago. I'm more than happy to confirm that my doors are always open for such written notices. Beyond that formal statement, and in the hope that this is helpful to members in all parts of the House, I would emphasise that we all heard what the chair of the Brexit Select Committee had to say. He indicated that the committee had made a public statement, that the committee had requested an urgent audience with the Secretary of State. And that information from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Leeds Central, was extremely important. The Minister responded indicating a willingness on the part of the Secretary of State to meet and to do so soon. Can I very politely say to the Minister, who's always a most courteous fellow, that he was wise to make that statement. And I think that when it is suggested that that meeting should be soon, it means soon. It does not mean weeks hence. It means very soon indeed. Nothing, no commitment, no other diarised engagement is more important than respecting the House, and in this case, the Committee of the House, which has ownership of this matter and to which the papers were to be provided. So that is where the matter rests. As and when matters evolve, if a further representation alleging contempt is made to me, I will consider it very promptly and come back to the House. I hope the House knows me well enough to know that I will do my duty.
Point of order, sir.
A point of order, Mr. Peter Bone.
Slightly on a separate issue, Mr. Speaker. Some members on this side of the House, and maybe on that side, asked for the government to come forward with a new motion clarifying and trying to clarify the distinction between the two differing motions before this House. Is there any technical reason why that motion could not be produced, having just debated a humble address?
No, it is possible. We shall see what happens. Well, the Honourable Gentleman shouldn't chunter from a sedentary position in evident disapproval of the thrust of the opinion expressed by the Honourable Gentleman Member for Wellingborough. If the Honourable Gentleman wishes to raise a point of order, I'm very happy to entertain it. Well, not again, says the Honourable Gentleman. Well, I'm afraid again. We'll hear from the Member, Right Honourable Gentleman Chingford Woodford Green in a moment. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, earlier in an answer to the urgent question, the Minister referred to the binding decision of the House on the 1st of November. He also referred to a non-binding decision that the House had taken on an earlier date, and he appeared to seek to interpret the second decision in terms of the first. Could you advise the House, Mr. Speaker, where a binding and subsequent resolution appears incompatible with an earlier non-binding resolution, which should take precedence?
The Honourable Gentleman can always discuss these matters if he wishes over a cup of tea with the Minister, if the Minister can spare the time to do so. I don't want to get into a detailed examination of all past motions. Suffice it to say, and I think this is important, there is a very recent motion passed by this House. I did not, if I may, very politely say to the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Holborn and St Pancras that it was my advice that the motion was binding or effective. As Speaker, I ruled that it was binding or effective, and that, I can say to the Honourable Gentleman, irrespective of other motions, remains the fact. And I said I will come briefly to the Honourable Gentleman. Point of order, Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
I apologise, Mr. Speaker, for pressing you to a further clarification, but I do so simply because it may help the House. Should a motion of contempt be applied in this particular case on that considered a motion that was originally the subject of discussion at the moment, but in the meantime a subsequent motion be placed that amends that motion, does that actually negate any charge of contempt on the previous requirement on the Secretary of State?
That is perfectly reasonable. I've known the Right Honourable Gentleman long enough to know that he has a fertile mind and he likes to explore all possible avenues. I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman will forgive me if I resort, and I do resort, to my usual response to what I regard as a hypothetical question, which is to pray in aid the wisdom of the late Lord Whitelaw, who was known to observe, I think, on more than one occasion, personally, I prefer to cross bridges only when I come to them. And I think that is probably the safest course in virtually every sense. Finally, I hope, point of order, Mr. Barry Sherman.
Speaker, the discussion we've just had leads really to the heart of how select committees operate. And can I say, as someone who chaired a select committee for 10 years, there's a long-established precedent of a chair of a select committee to be able to receive a highly sensitive document on his own, in private, and then deal with it sensitively and in a public-spirited way. That's a long tradition especially in very sensitive children inquiries in the education, why it can't apply at some stage. In this case, I don't know.
That is a very helpful piece of information from an extremely experienced former Select Committee chair. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. The House will have heard what he had to say. Point of order, Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Well, very generous, Mr. Speaker. You had said finally, but I delayed because it's related to what's gone on, but not quite the same. One member did actually very pertinently say this all arises from the curious practice which has started in this Parliament of the government not voting on opposition motions, which has never happened in the history of the House, I don't think. The result is that the proceedings of the House are becoming littered with motions which are extremely critical of the government and its policies, the vast majority of which I do not agree with, but it does reduce this House to a debating chamber, and it does raise the question of what is parliamentary accountability in modern times. Could you perhaps initiate some discussions between yourself and the usual channels to see how we can get back to the undoubted constitutional position we should have, which is that the government is accountable for all its actions and policies to this House of Commons, and it cannot simply ignore them, leaving as if they're the resolutions of some local tea party?
Well, I'm not sure how grateful I am to the right honourable and learned gentleman for his point of order, but my response is twofold. First, the address is just that, the address. Whether an attempt was made to amend it or not, and its binding quality is just that, irrespective of whether an attempt was made or wasn't made. It stands anyway. Secondly, the question of how the government deals with opposition day debate motions is a matter for the government. What the government has done to date is not disorderly. If the right honourable and learned gentleman has suggested, as I think he has, that at the very least it has not been helpful to the House, I certainly would not dissent from what the right honourable and learned gentleman has said. And I think it would be helpful. I think it would be helpful if people would reflect upon the wider implications or ramifications of their conduct on individual occasions. The right honourable learned gentleman has served in this House without interruption for 47 years, 5 months and 10 days. And I think he knows of what he speaks.
15 minutes.
If there are no further points of order, and I thank colleagues, that will do for now.